So good evening, good day, good afternoon, good morning. Thank you so much for joining us from all over the world at this Interact special, a fireside chat with Nadia Eghbal about her book, Working in Public, that just been released at Stripe Press. This is your debut. Nadia, I'm so happy that you're here with us from California. Interact are joining you from all over the world. How are you today? How is the book campaign coming along, and how does it feel to be a first-time author?
It's good. Everything is this crazy blur right now, but it's all very fun and had a little time to celebrate this weekend, so it was nice.
And has the process been affected by COVID at all, or how are you guys faring with the general craziness in the world with the first book?
This is my first book, so I don't have anything to compare it to for what it would have been like otherwise. I think I would have imagined that doing interviews and online events is actually kind of a nicer way to be able to reach lots of people instead of doing in-person stuff. So I'm pretty happy with it so far.
For example, you can do this with us today, which would have been hard to organize and bring everybody to San Francisco to meet you in person. So I'm very happy that we can be doing this. Maybe this is a silver lining. One of the things that really struck me when I was reading your book was that, well, you're a very young person, right? You're in your early 30s, yet this book feels like not even a first book, but some kind of a summary of a long and adventurous life, both in academic research and in something that feels like, well, product management. And I'm wondering what were the key, milestones in the past years for you that you felt most influenced the formation of this book, and most of all, its structure, right? So the building and maintenance parts of the book.
You mean just sort of like the process leading up to the book itself? It was a process from kind of like, I think culminating over the past 5 years or so of looking into open source. And I've written about this before, but I kind of see it as like having these roughly like three phases. So one was the super early research phase that I did where I was just sort of like on my own exploring questions, not really sure what it was going to turn into, talking to lots of open source developers to understand how are they managing their projects. And I didn't have any background in open source. I didn't really know what I was doing. I just was sort of taken by this idea that there are things in tech that aren't clearly venture backable companies and aren't these opportunities that we're used to thinking of, but are still adding a lot of value to what we think of as tech. And so it's just sort of fascinated by this underlying open source infrastructure that everyone is using and relying on to write their software. And so, so it kind of started with open conversations with developers. And I had a grant from the Ford Foundation at the time, which was sort of paying my bills, but nothing crazy. And then just started writing about it. So that was the first sort of formative phase, I guess, where I was just sort of even discovering what the problem was and starting to write about it and documented that in a report for the Ford Foundation called Roads and Bridges, the Unseen Labor Behind Our Digital Infrastructure. And that was kind of the first big published work that I'd done in this space. And then I went to GitHub, and then that was really impactful in a different sort of way because I was a practitioner then, and I was on the inside working at this platform that is providing a service to all these open source developers and is kind of the de facto place where open source software and a lot of software in general is hosted. And so while I was there, I'd kind of come in already with a lot of questions on my mind based on the conversations I'd been having and the thesis that I kind of put forth in Roads and Bridges. And a lot of those early conversations, my takeaway was basically, okay, we think open source is this really collaborative endeavor with lots of people pitching in, but it turns out a lot of these critically used open source projects actually just have one person at the helm or a few people, even if they're being widely used by tons and tons of people. And so I was trying to basically go through, okay, that's a problem. What is what would the solution be to that? And came into GitHub with the theory of, okay, what I'm hearing from a lot of developers is they just need more contributors. And so I was okay, how do we get more contributors to open source, and kind of coming at it from that angle. But while I was at GitHub, I got exposed to so many different projects, including ones I hadn't thought to seek out myself because I was just sort of seeing the wide spectrum of everything. And so just like kind of, you know, taking my own hypothesis and then mentally applying it to all these different situations I was seeing, like, you know, hundreds, thousands of projects, starting to feel like, okay, I don't feel like the more contributors thing really answers the question, because in some cases, maintainers are really bending over backwards to try to get more contributors, and they're just like not coming for whatever reason. Or you could see on some projects, like, it wasn't really that they didn't have enough contributors, but they didn't have enough dedicated contributors. So they were getting tons of like inbound and just sort of like spammy volume, I guess, to their project. And so then I was like, okay, like, it feels like there's actually like a bunch of different situations we're talking about here. But yeah, like GitHub was sort of like that, just that like first time for me to start actually like feeling like my ideas were being tested a little bit, and like maybe I wasn't correct about everything. And then so after I left GitHub, I was lucky to end up in a situation at Protocol Labs where they basically just like, they have a research arm, and they let me be an independent researcher there and basically do the work that I wanted to do, which ended up turning into the book. And so that was sort of where I was like, okay, I'm armed with like the practical information from GitHub, these like sort of like more theoretical conversations I've had with lots of developers, like, what can I kind of take away from that and synthesize? And yeah, and so like, you know, wrote up a bunch of thoughts and ideas early on after leaving GitHub, and then was like, okay, I kind of actually I feel like we're missing a bunch of vocabulary and a bunch of like taxonomy, I guess, to like understand what's going on here. And that was what prompted the book. And I would say kind of like the final like memorable phase for me, or just like period in writing the book, was it felt like a lot of the questions I was exploring in open source were about this thing that we're all kind of going through, which is everyone's getting too many notifications. Everyone's in this like very like public social media kind of space, and like trying to figure out how to deal with like too much inbound and too much stuff that they could possibly be looking at. And just like seeing how that was starting to like evolve in our more like public social landscape. And at some point it was just like, oh, right, like obviously like, you know, the idea of like a community has gotten so big that like we just need to like refactor what we mean when we talk about online communities. And sort of like having that kind of realization around the time that I started writing the book helped, I think, create a little bit of like the so what in the book that wasn't just documenting what was happening in open source, but being like, why does this actually matter? And like, you know, why should we care about this even if you're not an open source developer, which I tried to tie together in the book.
I think you were very successful at that. And it's so amazing to me that you were this pioneer kind of intuiting something well before most other people did. And now you published a book right in the middle of its zeitgeist. It feels like this beautiful arc of the world catching up with you in the middle of this craziness. And it's so beautiful it was for me to kind of retrace your career and see your thinking. So I'm quite curious, you're mentioning this beautiful arc that might be called Hegelian, right? I'm a Central European, so for me, every triad looks Hegelian. You know, you have the theory, and then you test your theory in real life, and you suddenly realize that a lot of that doesn't add up, right? You have to update your concepts about certain things because contributors are not coming, even though on paper it shows that they should be coming at this prompt, and they are not. And then you have to go more, you know, hands-on, and then you have the kind of synthesizing moment where you merge or marry the practice of the theory. But I'm wondering, where did this start for you? Was it the Ostrom affinity that later on developed into a fascination with open source, or was it more that you were interested in open source and software and kind of acquired the social sciences knowledge to support your work? How is it, the chicken or the egg?
Yeah, maybe both. I mean, I definitely did not like grow up with any sort of, I definitely had a very strong liberal arts kind of background, I guess I'll put it that way. And so I've always felt like I'm the one who's kind of coming into software as more of an outsider than, you know, I was a software developer. And then like I figured out, I mean, I like consider myself a very amateur software developer enough that like, I don't think I would have even thought to look at open source if I hadn't had this experience of, you know, like typing one thing in the command line and suddenly like you have this voluminous output and you're like, wow, like I actually like barely have to write any code at all. Like I'm just pulling in stuff from other people. Is this magical experience, I think, for anyone learning to write software. And that sort of sparked my interest when I was thinking about open source of like, oh yeah, like I know what it feels like to benefit from like not having to write that much code because I'm relying on all these other people out there. Who are those people? Like, where does this stuff come from? So yeah, I mean, I think like I consider myself to be more of the outsider in software than the other way around. But like some of the specific concepts that came through the book are definitely thanks to just like people I met along the way, which is I think a nice thing about writing a book. You kind of feel like I've taken so much more interest now in reading the acknowledgement section of other books, because then you realize like you start to see like how people say, you know, this person gave me an idea that like shaped the entire book or whatever. And I went through that experience myself. Michael Nielsen, who like exposed me to some of Elinor Ostrom's theories. Then I kind of like went down this rabbit hole and was like, oh gosh, like that totally applies to this. Liz Voller, who exposed me to a bunch of ideas around just like infrastructure, also super useful. And I think also, so my friend Devin Zugel, who's product director of open source product at GitHub, came from like the city's urbanism kind of background into open source, and then like learning from her, I think like where she saw these really interesting parallels between like cities and people, helped bring me to like Jane Jacobs, for example, which also fed into the book. So yeah, I don't know, it's kind of nice to like look at the finished product of the book, and that like sometimes I think like, you know, some other author or some other writer who came across this same problem would have probably had an entirely different lens on like the different concepts and ideas that they pulled in. And I can see it even in like some of the like reviews I've read so far of people being like, oh, it's like this thing. And I'm like, oh yeah, it is like that thing. I never thought of that. But I love like looking at this like finished product of a book, because you see like all your friends in it, and you're like, oh wow, this is actually a product of like myself and like and the people that I surrounded myself with that like produce this one lens on it. And it doesn't mean it has to be like the be all end all most correct one. It's just sort of like, yeah, it feels like a very natural reflection of like who you are, I guess.
I love that you mentioned in the recent podcast that you went on at A16Z with Sonal, that you were so lucky that in the middle of writing the book, Eugene Y published the Status as a Service blog post. And so you were kind of like handed, it was so useful for my work as well, obviously, the Interact. You know, you're just kind of handed this bouquet of new vocabulary, and you're like, yay, thank you, Eugene. It's just like, it's so much easier to think about.
It is like one of the big struggles with like writing a long piece, because I feel like what justified like writing a book for myself was, okay, I want to like define all this vocabulary, but then you have to like use that vocabulary throughout the book. But it's a lot of like work up front where you have to like establish, okay, here's what I mean by this, here's what I mean by this, and then you like use it later on, or at least that was my writing style. And then yeah, I was trying to like explain some of the things around like the ties between open source and like social platforms more broadly. And then Eugene wrote that status as a service post at one point. I was just like, yes, finally I can like use this concept. Thank God there's like a gift from the gods. And so it's just like, yeah, it's nice to, you see the book kind of like evolving as like things are just like happening in the world, and you're like, oh, finally I can like grab that, and like it's like making a potion or something, and you grab all these little ingredients and throw them in.
Well, I think that was very successful. And one of the things that I really enjoyed about the book is how clean it is. I mean, it's very dense with ideas, but I never felt lost with the vocabulary. I remember when you bring in, you know, the low discount idea, and then it was so beautifully tied in together with skin in the game and stickiness. And I felt like so many, you know, expressions are popping up that we in the internet kind of came up with to describe our own functioning. Stickiness is something that we just came up to express something that happens at salons. And it was so great to kind of see something that we discovered in practice also to tie into the different concepts that you're more or less familiar with from different blog posts or you know, papers and from the work of thinkers. Thank you so much, Nadia. Is it okay if I open the floor now? So if we have time for 2 questions. I think Amal, you were the first one, and let's see if there's another question. Just put your hands up in Zoom. So you go to participants and then the raise hand button if you want to go. Thank you, Amal. The floor is yours now, and I will call out the next person if I see another hand. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Hi everyone, this is my first salon. Nice to meet you all. I'm based in Boston, and I'm also a software engineer. I'm sorry, I have a dry throat right now. So Nadia, thank you so much for a wonderful introduction. Your friend Devin from GitHub and I were actually just featured on Changelog's trailer together. They made a really like trailer for the podcast, and Devin was like, yeah, so we were 3 people, and Devin and I were 2 of them. So it was really special for me. But what's really interesting about that trailer is that in her snippet was about how she wants children in the future, you know, to want to be a fireman or a doctor or an open source developer. Like that's what she said. Like she wants kids to be excited about like being open source developers, right? And so for me, you know, hearing you say that like it was like, I don't know, using your terminal for the first time and wondering where all this code came from that you didn't write. Like that's like a fascinating story to hear that was your connection to like our community. But like what I want to understand is like, what is it going to take for us to bridge that gap like at mass scale, right? Because, you know, internet literacy is like such a big problem, and it's something that I'm personally interested in tackling and like spending a good chunk of my life doing in the future, you know. But like we're just like, it's just the gap is already happening even with people who write software for the web and software for the cloud and software for AI, right? Like there's already a bridging gap like within the technocrats, like already people are being left behind in a sense. So, I mean, there's just so much here, right? And like we have so much to do, and we're not going to stop the machine. I mean, right? So like, how do we catch up? It just feels like a losing battle.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think there's like, I think there's a lot to be optimistic about, even if you kind of like take the long view of programming tools that are available, and like the fact that so much of it is open source now, and is like that is de facto the case, is like kind of like its own sort of miracle. And that, you know, there used to be programming languages that were closed source, which is like insane to think about. There still are for certain certain niches and fields, but the fact that I guess like step one is I'm optimistic about, like, you know, step one is that like a lot of these tools and frameworks are available for people that if you have a laptop, which is already itself a barrier, but if you have access to like being able to access the internet and you have a laptop, you can like go tinker with these things that are available. I think like one great positive trend that I've seen over the past few years, and it is continuing to grow, is just the absolute proliferation of educational content that is being made available now for software developers. And I touched on this a little bit in the book, and talking about the whole time in the book, I'm talking about open source developers, and open source developers being like, you know, people that are actively developing an open source project. But then there's this sort of like surrounding ecosystem of just like celebrity developers on their own right, who are developing their own audiences, and they're doing things like posting tutorials or live streams or any newsletters, just like all sorts of content around like, here's how you use this thing, which is like really cool to see, and I think is like similar but different maybe to like the actual like open source developer kind of problem, but I think both could really benefit from this like more market transition to a reputation type economy for open source software, because you're enabling more people to be able to just like create all this useful content that helps teach people and helps more people get involved. I mean, they're like people like don't believe me outside of software. I'm just like, there are software developers that have like hundreds of thousands of followers on Twitter, and they like post like TikToks of themselves. And it's like it's just like any other type of creator. And so I think that is why it is important to have this sort of lens on, what does like a creator economy look like for software at large, for open source specifically, and making that kind of information just like very freely available, both the technology and also like that informational, educational content.
Thank you so much. Anyone else, any audience questions? If not, we will move on this time. Okay, let's move on. In the meantime, if you have a question, just like put your hand up, and we will at some point get to you. So it's worth doing it. One of the contradictions, I mean, obviously your book feels like, you know, this beautiful trajectory across a variety of contradictions, right, that you're trying to resolve. There is the, you know, allocation and discovery and gated communities versus working in public, and the differences between, you know, making and maintaining, which I found really, really interesting. And obviously for us, I think the most timely question was where you explain the contradiction of working in public and the gated community, right? There are a lot of examples. I think the most resonant of them being the group chat, which is probably familiar to all of us here in the room, wherever we're located in the world. And I was wondering, why do you think do we have this enormous desire to work in public in the 21st century? Is it just because we can? Or is it because if we get it right, the status gains are so enormous? It feels kind of, all these contradictions, as you kind of weave through them, contain a lot of unintuitive things, right? Why would people want to work for free on open source software, et cetera, et cetera? So I'm just really curious about your views on the timeliness of the working in public idea. And I know that Devon is also very dedicated to this question.
I think they're like both intrinsic and extrinsic motives we can point to. And they sometimes sort of clash in these interesting ways where, like, yeah, I mean, let's say Twitter or something, for example, like, why does anyone bother tweeting? There are reputational gains to be had for just like sharing stuff out. It is like a fairly legible way for people to like increase their perceived credibility, is just to be like, I mean, that's why I started doing that stuff too, we all do it to some extent probably, of, it's having just information and like basically like a visual portfolio of the things that you write about is like just like useful for yourself. And so maybe at its most like extreme self-serving kind of end, you could just say, well, people just do that because it's good for them. But then, yeah, I mean, there's like still, I think, this other side of it, which I also like very briefly touched on the book, but I think like is worth saying, of like, I think we also just share because we're like people and we want to feel heard. And like, I mean, I feel that way just like creatively, where sometimes it's like, yeah, I could write all this stuff and just keep it private, but like part of why I like to write is because like it's nice to connect with people. It's nice when someone says, oh, this resonated with me, or what do you think about this, or whatever. It's like we're just like, at risk of being overly simplistic, but like we're just like social creatures who want to feel bonded to other people. And so like if I kind of like take that lens on like, why people are working in public and like what does that evolution look like, it starts from, I think, this really nice place of I'm going to keep sharing no matter what. I don't think that's going to stop. And I think like some people have been full of this idea in open source, or even more broadly of what happens if people just like stop sharing. Like, I just like don't think that's going to happen. There's going to be such a proliferation of content no matter what, because like someone out there is always going to be wanting to write and share something they're doing. And so like we're never going to have like a shortage of supply. But then it's like, okay, given that, I don't know that everyone is always sharing things in public because they're looking to actively collaborate on it. Like some people are, but I mean, you're starting to see more people do this now in open source, where it's like, look, I'm going to publish my code because I think it might be interesting for you to read and maybe learn from. I'm not actively trying to develop this. Like, do not send me any pull requests or any issues around it. And so like, then it prompts this question of like, okay, like sometimes I want to share because I just want other people to read it. Whoever else is out there, maybe something nice will happen. But that doesn't mean that I actually want to like get in this long conversation with you. And so what is that difference between public and participatory content? And once we start kind of like drawing that line, then you can start to see all like interesting versions of communities formed that aren't maybe like what we're used to thinking of.
When it comes to open source, what are the stages of gaining status in that community? So you talk a lot about intrinsic motivation, which I found absolutely beautiful. I definitely need a community of people kind of self-selecting themselves into a community and then prove that they are, givers and not takers, that they, share value with a lot of other people and kind of like grow in this value-based system. And I'm curious, I know a little bit obviously about writers and artists a little bit better, but when it comes to software, how is the status built, and what is like the main prize that a contributor can get on for example, GitHub? How does it build? What would be the growth stages there?
Yeah, I guess it depends on, it definitely depends on the ecosystem and the level of contribution that you have, but it is not so dissimilar from writers, I think, of for someone that's, I guess maybe starting with like someone who's like authored a project or created a project and they publish something. like if it becomes this popular project, they're known as like, oh, you're the person who created this, which is like being an author who wrote whatever book or whatever. Then the difference kind of being that, and if I, with this book that I wrote, I thank God do not have to continue to revise it for like the rest of my life, because that would be really annoying. But if you're a creator of an open source project, it's living software that other people are using. So you're going to have to, unless you put your foot down on it, like people are going to continue to try to shape and improve and change it over time. So now I have to maintain this thing that I created for forever, long after I've, had any desire to care for it. But I'd say like the most common like reputational reward, I guess, that people talk about in open source is getting a really sweet job somewhere as a software developer. And that's probably true for even like more casual contributors where like depending on the project, but if you made a contribution to like a high status project or something, or something that like shows off your skills, it's just more things that your employer can see in public that is like evidence of how you work with someone or how you write code. It's not just about your technical skills, but it can also be about your social skills. And so, yeah, those are, I guess the benefit is the highest prize that you can really get right now in open source, which is why it's a little bit silly, I think, is like getting a job somewhere. Which I at one point in the book, I'm just sort of like, it's like crazy to me that we imagine like
basically a public portfolio.
Yeah. I mean, like we don't say that for like the top Twitch streamers, like they're like millionaires, like, and they like strike it on their own. We're not like, oh, you can now work at ESPN or something. It's like, there is a path to going forward. Maybe going back to like the earlier question about, Devin saying that, she wishes that kids can grow up saying, I want to be an open source developer, much like being a firefighter or something. Like kids these days, apparently, according to the youth, are talking about like, now they say they want to be like a YouTube star is like a really common thing that a kid says they want to be, which is awesome. But like, it's so sad that they don't say, I want open source developers to be as high status and have this path to financial success in the same way that like being a YouTube star would be. But right now it's just like, yeah, you can work somewhere. And I don't know how much anyone follows this stuff in software. But like, I mean, some developers like tweeted about their salaries. I think Dan Abramov, who's like one of the most famous open sourse developers, has a huge following. He tweeted at some point, I think he makes like $100K or something a year in his job at Facebook as he created like a very important part of the React ecosystem. And everyone was like shocked at this because they were just like, wait, but like, you're Dan Abramov. So the prize may not even, financially speaking, even be so like, so shockingly high.
Thank you so much. I see a lot of hands up, so I'm just going to call out people. Rob, do you want to go first? And then Joe.
Sure. Hi. So I have been very fascinated with the way that online communities work for quite some time now, especially the online communities that we see for emergent products, right? So we see companies like Notion, Roam, Airtable, etc., like these horizontal products that they have communities of users that contribute content, they contribute support to other users. And I'm curious what you think might be like some different characteristics, traits, behaviors of members, between these product communities, like where they're not contributing to they're not like changing the product necessarily itself, but they're just kind of like supporting each other, so I'm curious your thoughts on that.
It's a good question. There's like a whole, I guess, so one of the things I tried to do in like kind of writing out my own taxonomy or sense of open source project communities was distinguishing between contributors and like active users. And so like within the contributor category, I guess like you have like very casual contributors that are like just adding a quick fix, tend to be like more self-interested, have some problem they need to get addressed. And then you have like the active contributors who are more like the members of communities that are like very actively stewarding the project and developing it. But then I kind of like have this whole other like bucket of active users, which sounds kind of more similar to what you're talking about with product communities, where they're not working on they're not actively developing the project itself, as in like the code repository, but they're kind of part of this like broader ecosystem of people that are creating educational content or hosting events or have these like user-to-user support systems, which are, yeah, I think like right now in open source, we tend to call those people contributors, but I think there is a need to talk about like contributors who can like actually like are changing the code itself versus like contributors who are like very active users, because I think even a lot of those users themselves don't think of themselves as contributors. They think of themselves as like, I'm just a big fan of this community and like I love making stuff and putting it out there. And so yeah, I think there's probably like a lot of parallels between the active users of an open source project and these product communities. And as you sort of like alluded to, it can be really beneficial for the creators as well, because it can take some of the load off of them being this bottleneck for like any sort of, like, for example, like with user-to-user support, like users can help each other with answering questions and things like that, which we see like all sorts of software companies do, regardless of open source or not, where like it's less support that the company themselves have to provide, or same thing with like educational content or events and stuff. It's like, it's better for the company if they don't have to do everything themselves, where like their users are so excited they're like running that stuff themselves. So yeah, definitely like a really useful thing to encourage.
Thank you so much. And maybe this is a good moment to talk a little bit about one of the most exciting parts in your book, which is your kind of taxonomy of the 4 different community types, kind of taking into account their growth in terms of participants, whether that's contributors or users, right? Do you mind? I hope that most people read chapter 2 who have gathered here, but do you want to maybe just give us a little bit of an intro into that, and how are you surprised that everybody's super psyched about this part and we're all trying to apply your formula to our communities, or was this something that would happen in our era of proliferation of online communities?
Yeah, I mean, I think like we're starting to do it all in just like, yeah, we're seeing evidence of this happening anyway in the social web. Like I think it happens regardless, and I'm hoping like trying to make a small contribution of like helping provide maybe some like thinking or just framework around like how do we think about these different types of communities forming. And so yeah, the origin of that taxonomy was my experience with open source projects being that we like everyone, there's this one term open source project, which really just refers to like this project has an open source license on it. It means anyone can like use it in certain ways, but like really tells us nothing about how the project is produced or anything that's going on that like creation production side of things. And this leads to a lot of issues because like, I mean, I get questions all the time about open source projects that are like enormous, like the kinds that are like trying to take down AWS or whatever, like very large corporate enterprise focused projects, which are really different from a single developer who's released like 100 different NPM modules. And it's just sort of like, here's some stuff I'm making over the weekend. Like, it's just, I find that vocabulary very limiting to say both those things are projects, which they are, but like, can we get a little more granular about what that means? And I think similarly with communities, we're having that same sort of struggle of like, is Facebook a community? Like Instagram calls itself a community and it's PR, but like, this is like, it's so big, like how, versus, my group chat is also a community, and that's like so different from like Instagram, the platform. And so basically, so in order for me to try to think about like, okay, well, what vocabulary could we use that's a little bit more granular? How are these different communities different? I started thinking about, okay, like in an open source project, we mostly talk about contributors, and the kind of like rhetoric that most people use around open source is leaning towards the idea that like all users are potential contributors. So it creates this idea of like, you could think about like some sort of like hobby meetup kind of group where like you have, 10 or 15 or 20 members, and everyone's like an active member. They show up to the meetings, they talk to each other, they like collaborate on stuff together. But to me is like very limited by scale. Like that works for, right, like maybe 10 or 15 people. It's really hard to think about a community of like 1 billion people. And like, are all those people also active members in the community? So I started to separate out, okay, like you have users and you have contributors. Like users are people who might be like viewing the project or consuming the project, but are not necessarily like participating in it. And then you have the contributors who are like in some shape or form participating in the project and making themselves known. And then I looked at projects and said, okay, like are these high or low user growth or high or low contributor growth? And came up with these sort of like 4 categories that you mentioned. And so clubs are both clubs are high contributor growth, but low user growth, meaning that you have, a high number of contributors who are like actively participating in a club kind of thing, but there just aren't that many people that are like passively viewing it. And so like group chat is a good example of that, because it's like, it's me and whoever's in the group chat. There's no like outside viewers of that. Clubhouse, the app right now, is like the perfect example of a club. So very well named. And then then there's like federations. Federations have both high contributors and high users, meaning that these are kind of like the really big project that we think about. Like Wikipedia might be an example of this, where you have like hundreds of people that contribute, and also like millions of people that are using Wikipedia all the time. And so they have these sort of like interesting governance questions around like how do we manage contributors and like grow a sizable contributor community to serve this very large audience of people. The least interesting of these four categories is toys, which are both low user and low contributors. That's sort of like someone called this like proto communities, which I kind of liked, of like, you know, very, very early stage. No one's really using it. No one's really looking at what you're doing. It might just be you like tinkering around with an idea. And then the last category, which I think is like very relevant for what's happening on the social web today, is stadiums. And so stadiums have low contributor growth, but high user growth, meaning that you have like, these are sort of like the creator-centric communities where you're like an Instagram influencer and you have this like huge audience of millions of people, and it's kind of just like you managing it, right? And so it's a very different kind of setup from being like a club, for example, where you have multiple members and you're like coordinating with each other, versus if it's just kind of me but I need to deal with all these people. The way I'm going to think about that problem is really different. It's going to be more about, all right, how do I manage this like crazy inbound volume myself? I'm going to probably set up some tools, automation, controls, going to start like filtering things out so I can like focus on what I need to focus on. Whereas if you have more of this like active community, it's like, all right, let's just get more members and recruit them, and like, let's get more volunteers. That's not going to really happen in a stadium style community. So those are the different taxonomy I was using both for open source projects, and feeling like that also applies to a lot of what is happening in online communities today.
Thank you so much. And I also think that you kind of resolve this contradiction when you talk about maybe a reinvented stadium model in the book, where you do have this working in public and relative openness to participants, but not necessarily to encourage everybody to participate, right? Because it might cause this weird bystander effect where everybody will, wait for somebody else to do the job. And you're very vocal about using Ostrom's framework, the 8 kind of rules that makes a common well functioning, because there are good ways in software as well, in online community as well, to avoid the tragedy of the commons. And I'm quite curious about this. Do you think that when we think about software influencers and when we think about the loudest voices in an open source community, is there going to be a new wave of innovation in governance there that will encourage people to come and watch and learn from other people innovating and working in public, but not necessarily to always want to participate or to having to earn participation? And whether you see Twitch as some kind of an innovator in this area?
Yeah, I feel like Twitch is sort of like the first, most clear example of a stadium to me, where you really have like individual streamers, and you have this community that forms around them, which I think, like, if you think of like early days of Instagram, for example, was not exactly like that before we had like creators, which then kind of flocked to the platform and changed the shape of it. But yeah, I think like it might not be governance in the strictest sense of I think the coordination problems are less prominent in a stadium style community because you do just have a few people involved. So it is a lot less about coordinating between contributors, but it is governance in the sense of like just setting the norms of like, here's how things run here. And I think right now, part of the issue is like we've been trying to apply this like very communitarian, highly participatory model, which works for other types of communities, to like a stadium model. And then you have this experience, which I would hear from maintainers, and which helped challenge my views on this early on, where they're like, oh God, I don't want more contributors. Like, please do not send more contributors my way, because they're just like I get like, you know, hundreds of pull requests a week. Like, I don't want to be reviewing more stuff. I want to be looking at less stuff, which is not what you would hear in, say, like a healthy club kind of community where they actually do want more members and they want regular participation. And so I think like understanding like which model we're talking about when we look at any given community can help understand why would a maintainer say something like that? Because sometimes they get pushback and then people say, well, you're not encouraging contributors. Like, your job is to bring in more participants. And so then it creates this conflict where they're like, no, you don't understand. Like, I don't want more participants. And so I'm hoping like having that kind of clear framework and vocabulary can help us understand like, when do you apply one governance model versus the other?
I found it extremely interesting, as you mentioned, you know, all these weird trade-offs in governance structure, right? Where you know, what powers or authority should maintainers have and how is that negotiated? How democratic should it be? I love this idea of the rough consensus, for example. I think it's anybody who actually leads a community or a startup that has a community around it will find this eminently resonating. Like, this is kind of the best that you can aspire to, right? Where I think you mentioned that every issue will be addressed, but not necessarily aligned. And so as we go, you know, as we grow communities, sometimes they shapeshift, right? You mentioned that the toys community, where neither the contributors nor the users are actually growing in number. Which you say is the least interesting. To me, it's potentially the most interesting type of community. I mean, this is what people work on until it gets really huge, right? Probably that's where all the gems are for those with the data science skills to actually make sense of all the little toys in the world. And so there's a lot of potential to change, to go from club to federation or federation to stadium. I would imagine stadiums don't necessarily revert back to toys, but the other way around is perfectly possible. So do you think that there will be kind of codified, will there be codified best practices in governance in how you change? I mean, we know that, for example, YC YC teaches startups how to change their policies as they grow, right? They have, you know, follow-ups for Series A, Series B, whatever stage you're in. And I'm wondering, is this the case for you know, clubs turning into federations and other shifts, or is there work to make that happen?
Yeah, that'd be interesting to have those sorts of models. I think like in some cases, it is possible to switch between models, and I cover some of the situations where I think that is possible in that section of the book. It depends on, like, some things are just gonna be stuck in what they are. So in open source, for example, like there's some projects that are just like really hard to contribute to because the maintainers have made it hard to contribute, and there's no reason why it should be so hard to contribute. They just, like, you know, let's say they just like have not really thought to document their processes, and they really do want contributors. They're like, I don't know, this is sort of an extreme example, but, you know, like, why they don't have any sort of contribution documentation, so anyone coming to that project has no idea how to contribute. And so if they added that documentation, then it might make it a lot easier for people to know how to contribute. Awesome. That could be like a really successful case of kind of going from, maybe you're this, like, you feel like a stadium model where it's just a few of you, but you want to be like a federation. And so, you know, unlocking that can move you in that direction to a different model. But then there's some things where they're just gonna be small or whatever, or maybe unnaturally large or whatever, for reasons that are maybe like innate to that community. So if you have a community of people that are focused on, I don't know, say you've got like just some sort of like really niche esoteric topic that like no one knows about, the like total market of people that you can expect to join your club, like really, really small, right? Like, just like no one really knows about this thing, and it's like a very specific interest. And so if you were to say, oh, why aren't we like a federation or something? It's like, well, because no one cares about your strange hobby interest or whatever. And there's versions of that for open source as well, where it's like there's some technologies that are like more obscure and esoteric that that other people are just probably never going to really learn to use, and so they're just going to have a naturally different shape. But yeah, I think there are things that can be done to like move people from one to the other. And it's not just, you know, encouraging more contributors. Sometimes there are also projects, I mean, a lot of times I think projects where they're like, why am I getting so many contributions? I actually just don't want any. And like there should also be sort of like these legible methods of they're trying to like cut down on the number of people that are submitting like spurious requests. And so there are probably things that could be done to do a little bit more of that gentle like gatekeeping around your contributions.
I love your notes on AstroPi, where you're like, this is never going to like blow up. There will always be like a small group of astrophysicists interested in Python. Or at least in proportion to the growth of the population of the world, right? It's always going to be a niche. We have 2 questions, so we will go to Joe first and then Amal. And guys, if you asked the question already and then you want to ask again, just like lower your hand in the middle, because I won't always know if you just forgot your hand up or is this a new question. Joe, take the floor. Thank you so much, Nadia.
Thanks so much, Anna. You set me up just perfectly. I was wanting to get to the different types of communities and this idea of a sort of a developmental arc of. So my interest is I envision having an open source community around in a field that's not programming. And I'm really curious to hear from you how you might extract what you've learned into a recommendation for how do you start such a thing. Like, I can imagine, like what I want to offer. There are intrinsic rewards for learning this new technology and participating. I can imagine that, like programming, it will have that sort of energy to it. There are also huge potential applications for a wider user base. And I just wonder what have you learned? Or I'm sorry I didn't get all the way through your book yet. I have a feeling there might be some of this towards the end. But like, how would you extract what you've learned to apply to a completely different domain? What would you do to start if your intention was to create a Linux-size federation?
Could you, if you don't mind sharing, like what type of community are you thinking about that is not software?
It's a community in the area of psychology. So it's a different kind of, let's say, mind technology that does what psychotherapy and other kinds of things do, but with higher resolution and more effectiveness that people can do with each other. So it is something that can be a peer-supported growth engine for a lot of people.
Yeah, I think a lot of people have tried to kind of take the concept of open source and then apply it to other communities. I think it's like I think it's tough to replicate the entire ecosystem because there are some things about software that are just, that lend themselves to, that there's sort of like its own sort of reputation incentive system that is hard to sort of like pick up and just like put somewhere else without the familiarity. So like, for example, there's a lot of talk about, why isn't there like open source design? And it's like, because designers are not really biased towards sharing in the same way that that software developers are for a host of other reasons. So I think like the literal, I guess, like concept of transferring open source is maybe harder to do, but I do think there are like a lot of the broader takeaways that I do cover of what does it mean to just sort of like work in public or share or encourage contributions, and that kind of stuff is maybe more portable of if you are aiming to be that kind of community that has a lot of contributors and a lot of active discussions. I would look at what like federations do, because they're all about, I mean, they need to survive by like encouraging as many contributions as possible, and they have a large user base to draw from. So I think like maybe that's kind of a first start, as well as like, how big is the potential audience of people that could become contributors, which could kind of tell you whether you're going to end up to being more like a club or being more like a federation. But yeah, I think in both cases, when the survival of your community is about bringing in lots of new people and encouraging them to stick around, then there's a lot you can take from sort of like best practices for encouraging open source contributions and applying to really any sort of like membership-based community where giving people as much power as possible and encouraging them to like run with their ideas is a big part of that.
Right, right. That's exactly sort of congruent with my vision. I'm sort of imagining starting as a toy, growing to a club, having that club be the hub of a stadium, and then having that stadium migrate to more of a federation, or maybe club inside of a stadium already is a federation. I don't know, but
the dream.
Yeah.
That's the
So
unicorn.
because what I fear going into this is becoming a stadium where there is that poverty of attention on my that I just can't address everything, and I want to bypass that. I definitely don't want to go there. So that's part of what I'm just kind of wanting to have a sense of a plan.
It's quite important in the book, the attention of the creator, right? We always talk about the attention of the consumer and the fight for the war for the attention. And I love that you are so realistic about this, Nadia, that actually creators also have attention limits. You know, in our community, this is about like how many salons can I go to, how many posts I can read in the online forums. Like people have, I mean, we have a biological clock around the day, right? And there's only so much valuable black you can put into this. But as you were talking about like designers, I saw all the designer members in our community kind of like nodding like, yeah, our incentive structures are very different. And I was reminded of Michael Nelson's book, Reinventing Discovery, where he talks about the incentive structures in open science, which is its own very tricky thing. I'm going to pass on the mic to Amal, and then I think we also have Girdar who has his hands up. Thank you so much, guys, for your patience as we get to you. We will get to everybody.
Hi, everyone. It's me again. I'm going to be the software developer persona for this evening. I just want to share some thoughts and get to my question next. So just to your earlier points around the prestige and the parallel maintainer community, which is called like the whatever you want to call them, celebrity developers or whatever. I have a foot in that world personally, so I totally can relate. And I guess I can tell you, for me as a software engineer, so I was most recently like an engineering manager at NPM. For those of you that don't know what NPM is, it's like the world's largest software repository and open source code distribution platform, and it was all JavaScript. Anyone that writes JavaScript like uses NPM, essentially, modern JavaScript. And it's like the most, I don't know, single point of failure for the JavaScript community. Like it really is. And so that company was recently just purchased by Microsoft GitHub. And anyways, so I'm no longer at that company. If that's helpful context for y'all. And so, you know, for me, like being a tool maker or working in a company that was like a tool maker for like, right, like I am upstream to every single developer in the planet that writes JavaScript. Like the like prestige associated with that, because ultimately when you're writing tools for consumers, it's a completely different story than when you are writing tools for other engineers. Other engineers are the hardest customer, and like I can't like you know, and so like anyone that's able to do that successfully, like there's like this other like, I would see like a third community of prestigious people that like build the tools that like serve these other two communities, you know? And so that's interesting just to note. You know, I also think that you said something about, I don't know, I lost my thought on that one. Anyways, so my question is, you know, to get to like there's so many people who don't know that like when successful open source communities have a bunch of people that don't even write code. They're like doing a lot of the other peripheral governance community stuff. And in many ways, like not only are they the glue and the backbone of these open source projects, but they are like literally the reason why they are successful and sustainable. And so for me, like in order to go from like a stadium to a federation, like it you know, you need the advocacy and support and like kind of forward thinkingness of those people. And so, you know, and in order to do that, like maintainers need to like be comfortable of letting go of power, right, and control, and also it's now like this project is now a shared responsibility. And like I don't, you know, I mean, it's a big bottleneck in our community, and I don't know if you can kind of speak to that.
I think it's tough when there are multiple maintainers involved that are performing like very different sorts of services and duties. I do touch on a little bit in the book about it's just like the interesting governance questions that do come when you're saying, okay, like we're trying to sustain, like, do you fund, I mean, it's so interesting with like open source projects in particular, or any sort of like community that doesn't have a, like, you know, legal structure associated with it, or any sort of formal organizational structure, where it's, you know, first the question of, are you raising money for like the project or for an individual developer? And like that is its own already like question. But then if all the money is kind of going to like one maintainer who's really, really well known, and then there's like, there are other maintainers, does that person like raise money just for themselves because they could probably raise a lot more money for themselves based on their own celebrity status, or are they doing it sort of like on behalf of the rest of the project? In which case it's like, you know, how do you distribute those resources to other people? And it gets into these really weird questions of like, you know, like, how do I even measure what your value is versus my value? And then like, how much money do you need versus what I need? But should we even base it on like need versus like how much you're contributing to the project and all this stuff? And so, yeah, I mean, all those, I guess I don't have anything like useful to share, except that it's definitely a thing that happens, and happens to a lot of different projects. And I think it just like, there is no one perfect answer of like, this is what, you know, this is how you solve the problem, but it does require a lot of these really active conversations about like, yeah, how do we distribute this in a way that is equitable and that makes everyone feel valued? But it's that's sort of like the thorny like conversational stuff, I guess, that every project has to deal with.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I would just want to point out though that like, there's also this other like challenge in which I've seen, which is like, you know, you have these projects go from, like you have projects like Webpack, for example, or Babel, right? Like these projects that gain so much mass adoption that they become a liability. And so they, you know, companies will start encouraging folks like projects like that to join foundations, right? It's like OpenJS, or, you know, formerly JavaScript Foundation, Node Foundation. So like Linux Foundation, right? So these projects join these foundations as a stabilizing effect, because, you know, they're just like, anything happening to these projects would just be such a liability for the ecosystem. And so, but then you have folks like Henry, who's I think our mutual friend, Nadia. I haven't met you, but like we have a close mutual friend. You know, Henry's like the lead maintainer of Babel, which is again one of the most like important projects in our ecosystem right now. And I've been pushing Henry to join a foundation, and he still refuses to do so, right? So then like that's another, I think, interesting, like, right, where like people are like really want to be independent in their governance model versus like folks that are willing to kind of join a foundation and have a little bit more like formal support.
Yeah, foundations are tough. I think they historically had a lot of value because you just had, like, each individual project was much bigger in its own right, and so it makes sense. You know, you can imagine like Linux Foundation is like, well, maybe that's actually a bad example since there are a lot of governance conflicts between the Linux the project and Linux the foundation. But anyway, like, I mean, a really big project having a foundation to support it. I've seen sort of just observing a trend away from foundations as projects are getting smaller and smaller, I think, because it's like a lot of overhead to manage a foundation, and they seem to be still very useful when there's like a lot of like corporate interests involved, because companies are really comfortable with foundations and having like this sort of like relationship to a foundation, giving money to a foundation versus giving money to an individual developer, for sure. And so there are some benefits there. It's hard for me to, yeah, I don't know. I think like there are probably ways to resolve governance issues that don't go through a foundation, because I would be hard pressed to name a foundation that I think is like running really well within open source. And I think it's not because all foundations are terrible, but just because like they have this sort of like historical relationship to like large corporate interests. And I can imagine that's maybe some of the hesitation for a lot of these projects that are, especially in, JavaScript is such a funny one, because like a lot of other programming ecosystems have foundations. Like Python Foundation, actually I would say, is like great fun, like seems to be doing really great. So yeah, I shouldn't just speak off the fly of there are foundations that are great. But yeah, like JavaScript has sort of like historically lacked any sort of like coherent foundation, and the JavaScript Foundation was sort of like had its own challenges. And I think maybe part of that does just point to like JavaScript is so like modular with so many different like small projects, which is maybe different from other ecosystems, that it becomes hard to like cohere those people around one entity. It's sort of like having like a, I just think about societies that are like living within someone else's governance. Like, I don't know, like if you have like tribes that like don't necessarily like are so distributed that they don't really lend themselves well to like one form of government, and like that sort of thing is like happening where everyone's sort of like managing their own project in their own sort of ways.
No, I think of it as like a pyramid. JavaScript like is the shared language for most programmers, and so it's really hard to wrangle the web, right? Like if you think about it as a pyramid, and JavaScript is like the lowest common denominator for all of us, right? So
we will come back to talk a little bit about governance issues later. Let's move on to Girdar's question, because he has been so patiently waiting, and don't forget any other points on governance issues that you might have had at this point. Thank you. Go, Girdar.
Hey, Nadia. I'm Girdar. I'm a PhD student at George Mason. So my question to you is, do you see a conventional education promote or stress enough of open source contribution? And how do you see conventional education systems promote open source contribution? And how do you see the marriage between the two of them? I think I recently read your post on reimagining the PhD, like how the whole the PhD program could be sort of working in public, plus also fulfilling the requirements of a PhD in an education system. So how do you see open source plus education working together?
So I can't speak to this too much since I didn't go through a computer science degree myself, so I don't have any, and I have not talked deeply to anyone about, so I'll just kind of caveat by saying that. I did see at GitHub, we had this whole education program that was focused on bringing GitHub to schools, and so I saw a little bit of what was going on just kind of through that. And like my understanding is that most computer science degrees or coursework that you're doing at a university is like not touching on open source at all, and like in some cases they're teaching languages that like most people are not really using today, or they're in many cases not even teaching Git, and so like there is this sort of disconnect between like what is being taught in a university versus like what are people kind of learning on their own. I would assume or hope, maybe taking the optimistic view, that like that is going to change over time. But I mean, yeah, like at GitHub, for example, there is a campus experts program for like helping connect to like university students and like have them bring GitHub to like to their own college campuses. They did a lot of work around like how do we bring GitHub into schools so that people understand what this thing is, and like don't graduate from understanding maybe like how computer science but not actually understanding how to like be a developer in the real world. And so yeah, like I guess like my cursory understanding of it is that there is still a lot of disconnect between formal coursework and practical learnings, but I can't speak to myself since I like didn't go through it. Yeah, I mean, I think maybe it's also like a great thing about having all these tools freely available is that people are sort of like self-learning regardless of what they're being taught in the classroom.
Is it because open source counts as some kind of counterculture in computer science, or is it something that if you study classical music, they are not going to expose you to death metal? Is it the equivalence?
I'd say, I mean, open source is like pretty mainstream at this point in the sense of like, you're going to have to use open source projects if you're going to be a software developer. And like, yeah, I mean, like even like using Git is like, does not mean that you're like, you'll use that even in like a closed source software job. It's just sort of like a way of managing your code. And so it is sort of like surprising that like some I've heard from some people going through coursework where it's like they were not even taught to use any sort of distributed version control at all. And it's sort of like, yeah, these are sort of like the fundamentals that are being missed. I think maybe like, I mean, in defense of universities, maybe I think part of it is just like software moves so fast and changes so fast. Like what was cool when I learned how to code in like, 2013, or even I see the mark of everyone I know who learned to code at the same time as I did, because we all learned Rails, we all learned Ruby, like it's just like and now everyone is like learning React and like whatever. It's like there's such like clear trends, and they change so quickly that I can see that like disconnect happening, like whereas like university coursework doesn't change nearly as much maybe.
And I love the part in the book where you're talking about Haskell developers, and that if you can code in Haskell, you will always have a job, because not enough people basically know that language to create a really tough competition. And I'm reminded of this friend I have in London who learned all these archaic programming languages, because all the old insurance companies and banks still run super old code. And he basically has zero competition in the entire city. Like, he can just like put any number on it and they will pay him, because what are you going to do if you're a legacy insurer in London founded in 1378, and that's also the age of your code a little bit. You have to hire this guy, right? So that also sounds like an interesting kind of countermeasure to trends in programming languages. But I'm also the Ruby generation in coding, so I think we have the shared.
I see you. Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's kind of the millennial baggage, mid to late millennial programming baggage. I would like to ask. I have actually one question left, and it's definitely about the governance thing that Amal you brought up earlier. And after that, I would like to just open the floor, and everybody's welcome to who has raised their hand will be able to go and ask a question. I'm really interested in the newcomer's dilemma that you outline in the book, Nadia. Not just because I'm leading this community and we have newcomers who have to kind of pick up the norms and the know-how and the MO in how we do things, right? And we have kind of veterans now, even though we're only a year old, basically as a community, as a company, and the onboarding is becoming more and more intricate, right? Because more and more things have happened. And I'm quite interested in this. I think there was a line in the book where you say, we have to create a situation where the people with the most skin in the game can have the most space to both use and contribute at peace, right? And get the most out of it. And basically the incentive structure, or the incentives are structured in a way that the more skin in the game you have, the more you get out of it. And so I'm curious how you see this emergence of two things, right? The working in public and the, okay, but let's do this in gated communities kind of thing, as a reaction to this, where you say, we have to ensure that the people who have put in the most work can actually take it out as well. And how that probably doesn't work on Twitter, where you can be, the more work you put into it, the more trolls you will have, right? And there are these kind of negative processes at place. So do you see that desire of getting as much out of it as what I put in as the cause of the gated community phenomenon? Or is it just that we've learned how social media works, more or less, and that's the only right way to react to it?
I think, for me, the resolution of those two kind of tensions of like more people are working in public, but then like also it's possible to become overwhelmed by people, a low context kind of community, is this break between what is public and what is participatory. And so like one of the things that I mentioned in the conclusion is this idea of like a one-way mirror, where anyone, you're sharing things out freely for people to view, consume, take what they want, like, go do what they want with it. People can see inside into your process, but then like maybe you could be a little more protected from like all of that coming right back at you, which I think is something that a lot of creators are experiencing. And so, I think like it's really just more about like, I would be really sad if like the goal, like I'm very long on working in public. Like, I think like it's, like I said, I don't think people will ever want to stop sharing things. And like the answer is not to, I think when a lot of creators get like sort of stressed out by the experience, they just kind of like shut off or like close off or stop doing things entirely. And like, I hope that there is sort of this middle ground where it's like, no, like it can be possible for you to continue to share things out, but just like start to put up a little bit of walls of like what you bring in back into yourself. And I think that's probably like more relevant for, well, no, I think it's probably relevant for like all the different community types I talked about. But I do think like if there is a possibility for you to that's sort of like a little bit separate to me from the like gatekeeping question around newcomers, which is a little bit more like the Eternal September problem that I referenced, which was this thing that Usenet was experiencing, a much older online forum, where like they would always have this thing every year where all these like new college students would get their like addresses and that now be able to like participate in Usenet. And so like every September they would get a flood of newcomers, and they would kind of like, you know, some of them would go away, and then some of them would kind of get more socialized in the community, and then like that would happen every year. But then once AOL offered access to Usenet, then like they had this Eternal September problem, which was like constant flood of newcomers coming in all the time. And so I think like in any sort of healthy multi-member kind of community, that when we're kind of not really talking about sort of like the stadium model, but maybe the other ones that have like more contributor growth, there's always sort of like this like starter culture. Like I don't know why I always use like yeast metaphors for things, even though I don't really bake bread that much. But I like this idea of like there's some like core group of something that needs to like remember like hold a little bit of that institutional knowledge, so that when new people come in, they can kind of like understand what this thing is all about, and you can help just help like socialize them into like whatever the norms are. If you don't have that sort of like central like hub of like people who understand the history of the community, then the community is just going to kind of like turn itself over entirely when you have too many newcomers. And then of course we see eventually like at some point in the life of a community, there's going to be inevitably some conflict between like the old guard and the new guard, and then everyone gets kind of pissed off and then like start some other community over here, and that's fine. Then they start to like proliferate and create multiple communities. I don't know if any of that really answered your question. I'm not exactly sure, but yeah, I do think they're like slightly different problems.
I think it definitely does answer this, or at least partially resolve this contradiction. And I'm wondering, you know, throughout this past decade in your life, as you went through thesis, antithesis, synthesis in your arc, arriving to the insights outlined in the book, have you arrived at any other points that you would add to Ostrom's list, the 8 things that make the common work? Is there anything that she might have missed? Or that she could not have known at the time?
I hadn't really thought about like what would I add to her list, but I did think about, and hopefully was sort of like putting forth this idea of like, here are the limitations of where this model can apply. So Elinor Ostrom wrote, I mean, her original work was focused on not online communities at all. She was focused on like fisheries and things that forests and like how these land resources are being managed. And then that's sort of like, that's the work she's best known for. But then towards like I think like late 90s, shortly, yeah, I don't know, somewhere around then, she, around sort of like the advent of the web, she did start writing about like digital commons and like what it means to manage knowledge as a commons. And so she was trying to like sort of like port some of those ideas onto the web. And it's a shame that she is not alive today, because I would be very curious to hear like what she thinks about like what is happening today, because I think her early maybe like synthesis of what was happening online and how that does or doesn't relate to commons made sense in the early days of the web before we kind of hit this insane scale. And so I think like where Ostrom's work does start to hit its limits a little bit, which other people have said, not just me, is, yeah, okay, I can use this to understand how groups of 10 or 50 or 100 might self-manage. What happens when you have like 1 million people or 1 billion people? There are like 2.5 billion people on Facebook right now. Like, it's hard to just say like, it's impossible to maintain Elinor Ostrom's conditions with that many people. It's just like, you know, there is, you need to like make meaning of your membership and have these sort of like boundaries and sense of identity, and like you're not going to have that with that many people. And so I think like my attempt or goal or hope here was to say, okay, like how can we take some of what she's saying and like extend it into like what it means to have communities at scale. And for me, again, like that separation between public and participatory helps do that for me, for where it's like, okay, there will always be this like group of people that are actively working with each other and participating, but not everyone who's involved in the community like has to be that. Like, it's okay to kind of like look in or consume it or take it and start your own community over here or whatever. But like, but you can't just sort of like infinitely grow the commons into these sort of massive sizes that we're seeing today.
I mean, the term common itself means something that is being shared in an equal measure by all participants, right? So you can't infinitely grow that pool. You have to, I mean, this is what kind of happens in nature as well. Like eventually you break down into smaller commons, right? Where that sharing can still take place. So it was also quite interesting to, read about fisheries in this book and how you may be writing code in Haskell on GitHub and still perform the same kind of rituals as a species of animals would in nature, because you're kind of responding to the same rules of maths and behavior. So it's quite interesting, and I'm looking forward to reading your next book, which will, I think, be entirely game theory based. And because there's a lot of game theory here already, and I think I feel that this am I correct in feeling that this really interests you at this point?
I think part of why I ended up I feel like I spent a lot of time on open source for this period of time, and in the course of writing the book became really interested in the parallels between open source and online communities more broadly, which is part of why I ended up at Substack after wrapping up the manuscript for the book, because I kind of now want to go back to this practitioner mindset of being okay, I think a lot of these ideas that for me originated in understanding open source communities and I'm now sort of mentally starting to port over to what's happening on the social web more broadly. I want to see how that plays out. And I kind of did the exercise in my head of okay, where do I think we could start to see some of those things happen, and where can I kind of be close to that? And for me, Substack as a newsletter platform, and newsletters kind of becoming this thing, was a really interesting place for me to be able to observe and understand it. So I think my views and interests will continue to morph in different ways over time. And so who knows what I'm gonna learn from my time at Substack, and see what happens next.
Is it a stadium? Is Substack a stadium?
Definitely. Well, I think newsletter communities definitely are in almost the strictest sense, where I am the sort of center of the community, or whoever the newsletter writer is the center of the community, and the gathering space only occurs when I send a post out, and otherwise other people can't email each other, right? I'm the only one that pushes out to this whole community. And yeah, I think part of why newsletters have become so interesting to people is because everyone is starting to crave a little bit of this quieter space to talk to their audience, or have a higher context kind of community, which is harder to get on a very, very public social platform, where your people are there, but they're kind of mixed in with all these other people you don't recognize. Whereas on a your newsletter subscriber list is your audience, and you're every time I send an email to my newsletter, I know that I'm talking to the same people every time, and so there's just something very comforting about that I think is not going to go away anytime soon.
It's quite intimate as well. And guys, if you haven't subscribed to Nadia's newsletter yet, she has one of the best newsletters in the world, and I love it. And every time I get it, first of all, every time I get an email, I think, oh, Nadia emailed me, and then I'm like, no, this is a newsletter. So there's also that interesting angle to it. And just generally, I love this very, minimalistic multidisciplinarity of your writing. That it's not multidisciplinary in the sense that it's a combination of 5 fancy disciplinary methods, is that it's all of it, but none. It's very, very kind of simple and refined. And I think that's really, really remarkable. And it's very in your book as well.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
So thank you so much. And so Rob and Amal, you still have your hand up. Does that mean that you have a new question, or you just forgot about it? Rob has a new question. Rob, go.
I forgot.
That's fine. And guys, if you have questions, put your little blue hand up. And if you don't have a question anymore, put it down. It's very simple. Thank you so much. Go, Rob.
Thank you for the opportunity to ask questions. I honestly have a million, but I'll narrow it down for now. But I'm curious how you see communities being a little bit different when the rules for when the group identity, when the rules for who's a member and who's not a member are blurred a little bit. For the example that's immediately coming to mind for me is, with Twitter, You know, like there's a lot of like little mini, what feels like communities in there, but there might or might not be a super strong group identity there. And it's also open and viewable by the public for anyone to come in and see, you know. And then there's also like a lot of communities online, especially like with the difference between like Reddit and alternatively like just random internet forums, where it's like with those internet forums, you knew everybody who's there, right? Whereas like with Reddit, I feel like you don't really like know everybody in your subreddit unless it's like a very small one. You don't have the same contributors over time. So yeah, I'm just curious how you think the behaviors of the members, you know, and your findings are a little different or the same when group identity isn't as clearly defined.
There's probably just like a spectrum, I guess, of, yeah, you could probably map them, I don't know, based on like porousness of communities or something over time. It's actually like the stickiness that you mentioned, Anna, of the like magnet and sticky terms were also something I pulled from research on like population migration trends in between states and things like that. So yeah, there's probably like a way to kind of like talk about those differences that is about like, you know, how magnetic are certain communities, and meaning like sort of like, yeah, what is the composite of returning members or more like, yeah, let's just say like returning or retained members versus newcomers. And if you kind of think of it that way, then like, yeah, like Twitter might have be extremely porous because like I am having that conversation, but like anyone, literally anyone can jump in if they wanted to, if they were to discover it. And I think it's maybe like part of like what makes it, I'm just like curious to see how some of these new features are going to play out on something like Twitter, because by nature it is so open. Like I don't even think of Twitter itself is like not a community. Twitter is just a platform, and then on there live all these little communities, but like they're not clearly defined in the way that on Reddit you have like subreddits, and it's like, okay, I know which subreddit I'm under, and it gives them like almost like a physical sense of space or a home or somewhere to like kind of draw the bounds around a little bit. Whereas with like Twitter, it's like it's not quite the same, and they've introduced some of these interesting features like being able to tweet but then limit who replies to your tweet, and so it creates almost this like, there's something that I still just find a little bit like uncanny about it, or like a little bit uncomfortable, where it like I'm still looking at this very public feed, but then now some of them are like more limited, whereas like if I'm on Reddit, like I don't get that same sort of sense because I know where the boundaries are. It's like sort of strange to like draw those boundaries like in the middle of a public square. It's like putting up like a little, I don't know, clubhouse or something in the middle of a town square and being like, oh, only some people can walk in here. But so anyway, yeah, I think like, yeah, the concept of members still applies. It's I just like every time I kind of look at a community, I'm always sort of thinking about like how porous is it, and how many of these people are sort of like regular retained members versus like how many of them are kind of like casually passing through. And that for me also helps distinguish between like when am I looking at like a stadium versus when am I looking at a club.
The drive-by effect, right? That you mentioned, yeah. Drive-by contributor. It's kind of come to my attention that most people, and I count myself into this group as well, we tend to underestimate the strength of community identity when we wander into a new space. It feels so customary that you just wander on a Reddit, you know, somebody drops into the interact and they don't necessarily, or, you know, a developer community on GitHub, and they don't necessarily immediately understand how important this place is to the identity of the people who actually actively participate or who really actively use that product. And I feel that this is also a trade-off, right? Because you can kind of put up a very scary code of conduct in your face immediately upon arrival and all the conditions that you have to meet in order to be admitted even to entry level. But that might actually scare away really good new contributors to that space, right? So you kind of have this, who do we invite in, and a lot of little tribal instincts kick in. We have a question from
something really quick on this.
Yes, and then I go to
I just wanted to say that like what you just said reminds me of Black Twitter. So when I first found out about Black Twitter, I immediately went to Google and I Googled Black Twitter, and I thought it was like this new product. I didn't realize that it was like an ecosystem within the product. Like, you know what I mean? And so I feel like, pardon?
Like dark mode or?
Yeah, like no, like something like another like a Twitter clone just for Black people. Like that's
Oh,
literally
right. Okay, that would make sense.
yeah, does that make sense? And so it's so funny, like then finding out no, Black Twitter is just that like 25% of Black people are on Twitter. You know, it's like okay, cool, I get it now. You know, so anyways, yeah, that's all I wanted to say.
Yeah, it's the communities that are hiding in plain sight kind of thing. It's really interesting. Whereas like on Reddit, you would see like a subreddit or something that you could just like waltz right in.
And that was super interesting to me when I was doing research for my first startup. That was a messaging app. I was doing a lot of proprietary research, and one of the things that really struck me was that there are a few immigrant groups within London society who use Twitter only through private accounts, and basically as Facebook. So you share with your family the semi-public posts within that gated community, which was quite interesting. Siddhartha, oh, you're there. Hi.
Hi, thanks, Anna. So a quick question for me. How do you, I'm interested in your thoughts and ideas about how you sort of raise the rewards, including the status rewards of sort of the grunt work, the sort of triage work, responding to pull requests. And like, given how important that work is there a way where ultimately monetary incentives don't become inevitable, even though, there are problems with extrinsic motivators like that. But given like how reliant we are on open source, is it inevitable that we end up using monetary incentives to incentivize that kind of work?
There are a bunch of initiatives around like open source bounty programs. And I think that probably like original inspiration for this is bounty programs within the world of security, which like I think functions kind of separately, as just my view on it, it functions differently from like how we incentivize open source contributions at large, because again, sort of like security researchers and programmers are people that are really excited at like, finding and discovering these vulnerabilities have their own sort of world and incentive system that is different from your average casual contributor. So like the one example I like to point to as to like where this stuff doesn't work so well is this initiative that GitHub, I think GitHub might still be doing it, called Hacktoberfest, where if you contribute 5 pull requests to open source, then you get a t-shirt, and you just have to I think you tag with like a label that says Hacktoberfest, and we'll like automatically figure that out. This sounds good in theory, and it's really well intentioned because it's encouraging more people to get into open source, and like still has that positive effect, I think, of like people that might not have contributed to open source otherwise, like it's giving them a reason to like try to do it. On the maintainer side of things, it's like a little bit of a logistical nightmare, because people will do anything for a t-shirt. And so like, people will submit a pull request that is technically a pull request, and it's just like, they changed a bit of white space or something, and they're just trying to get their t-shirt, and then they start harassing the maintainers being like, I need my t-shirt, like accept my pull request, and everyone's just like, whoa. And so it becomes, while there is like the educational function for people who have like never contributed before, it ends up serving this like net negative function for a lot of maintainers who are now being just like DDoSed by these like pull requests. And so maybe that just being an example to kind of point to, like I think fundamentally these casual contributors, which again I sort of like distinguish from active contributors, casual contributors are primarily self-motivated. Like they have a problem they want to get fixed for the most part. They're often, just identify as like users to the project. And so giving those types of contributors monetary rewards to submit pull requests can have this negative effect of now everyone just like wants to get their pull requests merged because they want money or whatever. And I've seen this also play out with like bounty programs where people are like, well, I really want to get this contribution merged in because I want to collect my bounty. And the maintainer is like, I'm not going to merge it because I don't like this. So it kind of like takes away some of the agency from the maintainer. I do think there are places where it can be done well. When there is sort of like a task that is maybe just like a maintenance task that no one wants to do and that is really hard to incentivize people to do, but like the maintainer is the one who wants it to happen, putting out a bounty and saying we will pay X number of dollars if someone will just like fix this for us. That can be like a really positive sort of thing. Having obviously like paying, maintainers full-time who are finding ways to help them get paid to work in open source full-time makes sense because they're already like very invested in the project. But yeah, I think like for like in terms of like how would one design a bounty program or have some sort of like financial reward or incentive in a way that is good for the project. I think it just kind of has to start with like the maintainer and their sense of control, and have them be the ones that are sort of like deciding what they actually need versus kind of like this outside program that is just sort of like rewarding people on the project.
Thank you so much. And we're running over time, so I'm just going to kind of drop in my last question here. And if anybody wants to, continue the conversation, we will have a channel for this in our online forum. So like after every salon, we will open the conversation. We will try to entice Nadia to join us for a little bit of maybe a follow-up chat. So my question, I think, to you, Nadia, would be, you published this book in the middle of this crazy time where we tend to respond to things by just like fleeing online, doing things, as well as we can in the middle of the lockdowns and this uncertainty. Is there anything where you changed your mind or updated your views since the publication of the book with regard to for example, community governance, or, the maybe unforeseen limitlessness of small communities, and if so, what would that update be?
Gosh, it's hard to say because we're still living in real time right now, and so sometimes like I think I've there's my sense of like what is interesting or what is right is like changing every week or month right now. One thing, if I had to like write a book about communities right now, that like if I wanted to like include some things that I hadn't included in there, I think one of these really interesting questions is around the sense of like space or place or like physicality of communities, and like how do platforms or the software that we use for our social interactions, like how is that shaped or not shaped? So I think like group chats and the future of group chats is a really interesting topic that I can't wait to see someone write a book about this in like 5 years or whatever. Where like group chats start out as just happening on like whatever messaging app that you have right now. But like messaging apps were not really designed for like group chats in the way that we use them now. Like, yes, they can accommodate multiple people on a thread, great. But like, what does it mean to be able to like create like your own culture or your own community of people on a group chat? And I feel like we run into some of those limitations in messaging apps that we like, being able to sort of like reference back on like in-group jokes or like photos or something, or being able to like spike off different threads. It's like a lot harder to do that because messaging apps are not really designed for that. And so, yeah, I'm curious to see kind of like where that develops, if it starts to become its own fully fleshed kind of part of the world, part of our social web. And then I think like the challenges in that do point to just these questions around like, how does our software enable or discourage just a sense of place and continuity for communities that isn't always like totally ephemeral. So yeah, those things I would put in a book if I were to write and publish it again based on what's been happening in the past five months.
I love this, and we use an open source platform for Interinteract Forum, and we have a lot of problems with it because there's simply nothing available to serve the exact needs of, for example, a community like ours, where the intellectual output is enormous. So we have like 300 monthly active users, and we are just about to pass 100,000 posts. And we opened this kind of forum on Valentine's Day, so we're relatively new, which is kind of the volume of it and the frequency is very both a challenge and a delight, and we're still trying to figure out what we can do with this software to kind of have it serve our needs better and work around our event management better and stuff like that. So we will have a very active moments ahead of us, I think, now, and your book has been enormously helpful for me to think about setting norms and just generally coordinating within our organization. So I will happily be a use case for your next book if you continue in this direction. Thank you so much for having joined us today, and thank you everybody for your amazing questions and great links in the chat. I'm going to, as usually we do, save out the chat, so we will have this for for posterity. And I will just upload this conversation on YouTube, so you can watch it again, reflect on maybe new questions, and we can get back to discussing some of these points. Thank you so much, Nadia. Have a lovely rest of your Sunday, and thank you everybody for having joined us. To be continued, hopefully soon, about open source. Internetech.com is where you can book for our events. We have a lot of really great things coming up this month. See you guys.
Thanks for having me.
Bye-bye. Thank you, Nadia. Bye.